Today, we're going to talk about Java optionals, avoiding null the right way. We're going to discuss the industry usage, common methods, and some quick examples. Why do optionals exist? They were introduced in Java 8 to model the absence of a value. It prevents null pointer exception, and it forces developers to think about missing data explicitly. It's used in modern APIs and service layers. This is the entire purpose of optional. Before we had optionals, we had to do all these null checks. So we had to check if the user was null. We had to check if the user get address was null. We had to check if the user get address get city was null. But with optionals, we can chain different methods in order to check for null pointer exceptions. So we go from this to something like this. And you'll see as we go through the presentation. So how do we use these in industry? So the repository and service methods return optionals where value may not exist. For example, if you're trying to grab something by ID from a database, there is a possibility that it may not exist. So this value is returned as an optional. And speaking of that, it's common in Spring data. So Spring Boot, so finding by ID returns an optional. It encourages safe handling instead of null checks. However, we try to avoid using optionals in fields or method parameters. So we have different optional types. We have the optional with the generic reference type. We have optional int, optional long, and optional doubles, which are basically primitive versions of optionals. And when I'm saying avoiding boxing overhead for primitives, it means that every time you create an optional, you have to create an object, and then you have to return the value. But here, it skips returning an actual optional object and just returning the primitive value. The explanation goes different than this, but for now, this should suffice. Okay, let's discuss common creation methods for optionals. So there's the optional of. So the optional of creates an optional, but in this case, the value cannot be null. So you have to be pretty sure that there's not a null value. Optional of nullable means that you can return a null value. Optional.empty means there is explicitly no value. You create an optional which is empty. All right, so here's a demonstration of the optional creation methods. So optional of, it must not be null. So here we're going to create an optional which takes in a string of Alice, and we're going to print that. We're also going to do optional of nullable, where we assign a null value in an optional which takes in the string, and we print that value. And then we're going to do an optional empty, where we're creating an optional that's empty. All right, let's run this. Okay, so we have an optional with Alice, and we have optional empty because there's a null value, and we have optional empty because this was explicitly declared to be empty. Next, we have common access methods. These include isPresent, ifPresent, orElse, orElseGet, orElseThrow, as well as map, flat map, and filter. All right, here are some access methods. So we have the isPresent combined with the get method. And the reason we have that is you typically do not use get with an optional unless you know that the value is going to be present. So if name1 is present, then get name1. So we're going to print this out. Okay. We can also refactor this. We can also refactor this and use name if present and then take in a consumer and print out the actual value, hello plus n. Of course, we have defaults such as or else. So if you're trying to assign a constant or a simple value, then you can use the or else. Otherwise, the or else get is better because the problem is that this or else will always run. And if there's an empty value, you don't really want to create an object. So you spent all this time creating an object just to realize that there's no value. This, on the other hand, will only run if there's a value to get. So it's only going to perform an action if there's a value to get or else get. Or else throw allows an optional to throw an exception if, yeah, let's say if empty. So this is empty, it throws an exception. Then we have map, which we used to transform this data and get the actual city from this user. So get name, get city. We have filter, which we used to filter values and get. We have flat map, which you can also use. And then, of course, we have the primitive optionals that we mentioned before, optional int, optional long, optional double. And we'll print these. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay. And it prints your access methods, your defaults, exception, your function operators, and your primitive optional types. Feel free to pause this if you need to slow down and take a better look. Otherwise, back to the presentation. So best practices for optionals. Return optional from methods that may not find data. Do not use optionals for class fields or setters in classes. We prefer to use orElseGet when default creation is expensive, as opposed to just orElse. And avoid call and get without checking present. So if you're going to use get, use if present method as well. Thank you. I'm out. Peace.